Yeah. So how does what you've described as God's inner journey relate to us and our own inner journey? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, that arc of his journey that we just talked about, coming from the idea of God as an external being who is a kind of superhuman hero, and then he evolves into a more humanitarian God where there's more of an I-thou dialogue, as Martin Buber would call it. You described it very well as a kind of existential shift. And then you come to the third phase where everything we associate with God is emptied out of our psyches. The experience of emptiness, which you usually think of the Zen Buddhists when you hear that, is very central to the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mystics. They all have an experience of God's oneness, oneness in all of nature, oneness among all of us. All of us are manifestations of the same Godhead. All of that is an emptying out of the contents we originally perceived God through. He's no longer a particular superhuman hero. He is much closer in many ways to what scientists talk about when they talk about God, and closer to what Spinoza talked about when he talked about the divine, a kind of being who is in and as nature. So that arc is something actually, if you look at a human life, most of us go through. Children cannot appreciate the idea of God the way someone like Meister Eckhart or Moses Cordovero from the Kabbalistic tradition talk about. They often experience God the way the Israelites did, as a being, as a person. And then as we grow older, if we're evolving, we come to the second phase, but within ourselves, where we begin to ask questions and not agree with everything God necessarily said in the older traditions. We develop more of an I-thou relationship. We develop a side of God that is much more multifaceted, not just two sides, good and evil. We begin to see the gray between the opposites. And then if we come into a more mature, adult-like vision of God for ourselves, coming from our deep psyches, where we might have a religious experience of one kind or another, well, there we're in the third phase of God's journey as depicted in history, but it's a psychological phase for us. So here we see that the historical phases of God's evolution parallel very nicely, for most of us, the evolution of God within ourselves, the evolution of the God image, as Jung talked about it.
I think this is a fascinating topic.